Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separating and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have family and friends who are separating, then this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own stories, experience and tips with the goal of helping people to end relationships in a kinder and better way. This is a personal separation story today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jessica Fostekew. Jess, it's lovely to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute privilege, and I'm going to say right at the outset, I'm a massive Motherland fan, so I'm going to be a little bit starstruck throughout. So apologies to anybody listening, but this is a real treat, and I'm really interested to hear about your story of your separation and where you are now. So let's start, if that's all right, by talking a little bit about your life prior to separating. So tell us a little bit about your relationship with your ex and how you came to have a child and then to go your separate ways.
Yeah. Well, I met him when I was 19 and fell head over heels. I don't think he was particularly fussed about having a relationship at that point, but over the years I wore him down. And to be honest, it was a lot of off and on for a long time, and then it was very much on, I think. Gosh, I can't remember the exact whens in terms of years, but years later we were an item. We broke up then, I think, because I've started doing stand-up in my mid-20s.
Right.
And bizarrely, that also felt like, it almost felt like cheating. I fell in love with something else. And I fell in love with stand-up. And it was very much an accident. I started stand-up with quite ignoble aims of actually getting more acting work. But so that was there was a moment there, and that's the first time I've ever, I don't know, anyway. We broke up then.
But did you talk about your relationship in your stand-up? Was that the kind of stand-up you were doing? Was that part of the issue, or was it just a totally different focus at that point? You focus on your career and wanting to move on and that kind of stuff.
I think also the relationship wasn't good at that point. I think,
right.
I don't know if he would agree with that, but at that point we had divergent stuff. He had. I would say lots of issues around trust, right. And I don't know. He had opinions on things I didn't feel it was his place to have opinions on in terms of me and my life. And actually, I was having this kind of awakening and sort of growing up, a wave of growing up, I think. And I suddenly went, I don't want to be. I don't. There was stuff that was socially difficult with us. I loved going out. He didn't, that kind of very different people. Had always been very different people. And at that point, I was like, no, I don't want to do, I don't want to do this. And we broke up, and I had another really serious relationship after that I thought was the one, but he left me, and I was devastated. And so then some years on, my son's dad and I reconnected. And it felt healing. It felt like we had both grown up a decade in those not quite 10 years of time. Yeah. I felt like I cared a lot less about what other people thought of my partner or my relationship. He represented for me at that point, me being ready to really be loved.
Right.
And to really receive love. And I'd stopped looking for someone, I suppose challenging, or, I really felt like I deserved to be with someone who really cared about me. Yeah. And we had a really, really good relationship. Much better communication, much better boundaries, much better support of each other. He was incredibly supportive of my career through, I would say, the hardest years of my career. There were the early years, your expectations are quite low and it's all tumultuous, and I was in my 20s and it's so fun, and you know it's a long game, and then there come these really tricky years with comedy anyway, with stand-up, where, and acting I suppose, but where you really realise, oh no, this is a long game.
Yeah, and I've got to start to make, exactly.
Yeah, and like, I'm not going to make the money.
Yeah.
You know, you watch your friends you're at university with suddenly start searing ahead of you in terms of income, security, and what feels like achievements. And that's when you really, it's, you know, a lot of people stop or give up and move on to something a bit more secure or rewarding. And he really backed me, and really, he was an absolutely brilliant partner. We had a great time, and I always knew I wanted kids. I don't know if that's a growing up in the countryside thing. Me and all my friends. I remember getting to university. I grew up in Dorset. I remember getting to London, you know, at 18, 19 for university, and meeting people and saying to people, yeah, you know, I'd like to have kids, probably around 30. And my friends would be like, what? Like, why would you even think about that? At the moment, I was like, oh. And I really wanted kids. He did want kids, but he wanted to wait. He liked taking a long time over things. I like rushing things. We met in the middle. We compromised. We waited a few years. It all happened a lot quicker than we expected it to. And I'd still to this day say that having our son is the best thing we've ever done together. We do parent him as a team well. We're a good team when it comes to that task.
I think it's so interesting, isn't it? Because when a relationship ends and breaks down, we're sort of so culturally primed to see it as a failure. But just listening to you then, in terms of that relationship, you know, having a son together, that's not a failure in any shape of the word, is it?
No,
it's a successful relationship that ran its course, and as I'm going to come on to this, that came to its end. But I think it's so fascinating how because we go through a breakup, we have to then denigrate what was, and clearly you've just explained it so beautifully, it was a lovely relationship that good things happened in and saw you through a big chunk of your adult life. Yeah,
a big chunk of it. I mean, you know, a huge chunk of my life. I can't imagine having never met him. You know, I've got absolutely zero regrets. He is an extraordinary, he's a lovely man, he's a gentle man, he's kind, he's a fantastic dad. And, you know, there is still a lot, I still love him, I still care about him. But there was a distancing, and I think what happened, there was a honeymoon period when our son was very tiny, but then actually I think we worked very well as a team, but we were increasingly working less well when we were physically together. And their physical distance grew between us in terms of intimacy and stuff. But like, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily that wasn't the crux of it. It was an emotional distance, and it wasn't until I think actually we had broken up that I realised there was a real cavern there for me, and I think emotionally had moved really far out of actually a romantic kind of love connection there. And I think we functioned so well for as well as we did after our son was born, because we were ships in the night. You know, he worked in the day, I worked in the night. We both supported each other on that front.
So you had the mechanics of it down, but there was just nothing behind the logistics and the mechanics of,
It worked really well, but we were barely together. And I don't know whether to go straight into the sort of descent of it, but from my point of view, we got on less well together. We weren't being, I don't think, even good friends to each other. And there was just so much frustration, and beyond the level of, I think, a standard amount of finding the person you cohabit with annoying. I think that's just human nature. And I think I did a lot of reading around it, and reading around sort of the well, not tons, you know, it wasn't the only thing I was reading. But I remember being quite overwhelmed by the discovery that, and I can't believe I never knew this, but that marriage used to be, and actually I should point out, him and I were never married. We were just
together,
common law, whatever it's called. But we we never that the idea of marriage used to be this sort of political, financial thing that you did to bond families, to pool wealth, kind of chattel sharing, and then we moved into, it's quite recent in history that we'd marry for love, and that actually there is an incredible stress on romantic relationships to maintain all these different things over an incredible amount of time, and actually I could just feel this distance. And I had a brilliant therapist. We didn't have relationship counselling, but I had an amazing therapist for me at the time, because I felt like I was stagnating in my career, but we ended up obviously getting into all sorts. And I do remember touching on stuff to do with the relationship, and I remember, they would say, would you watch television together? Would you hold hands, or would you be, I'm not talking about sexy business. I'm just like
just intimate. Yeah.
Would you be like, would you link arms while you watch telly, or put your arm around each other? And I was like, no. And that's bizarre, because at the beginning it was a really cuddly relationship, and I do remember trying to sort of hold hands watching telly and thinking, oh, what is this? Feels so weird. Like, it just wasn't there. And then I did all the things. I remember all the things I would say to sort of help spend more time together, for example, without your son, doing things just the two.
Date
really
nights,
listen,
all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I remember going on a couple of short breaks, just us, and getting on the worst that we have ever got on.
Because all your props are gone at that point, aren't they?
Yeah.
All the things that you've actually come to rely on are taken away, and it's just the two of you. It's useful because you're then staring at the relationship.
Yeah, I'm staring at something, from my point of view, broken, and there were several things that, and I think, and this is really brutal, but I think one of the things that made me another kind of wave of, oh, it is done, is somebody said, how would you feel if you imagined him with someone else? And I know this is a very kind of, I don't know, trad conservative monogamous view of the world to even ask that question, but I guess I still am those things-ish. And I imagined him with someone else and didn't mind, and thought, oh, crumbs, that's done, this is done.
Okay.
But it took me a long, long time to action that separation, because I felt like there was a wall of impossibility around it.
Yeah.
There were family circumstances, his family with ill health, and eventually losing a parent. There was financial reasons, but mainly obviously our son. I just thought, you don't break. I don't know. I mean, my parents separated when I was in my teens, and I look back retrospectively and think they probably should have done that years before they did as well. I get it now.
A lot of children of divorced parents say that, don't they? It's just, why did they, the fact that they stayed together for us feels so bad, because they'd have been happier had they gone their separate ways. It's really interesting to hear you say that.
And I watched, and I think again, in retrospect, I watched my parents stay together, technically together, way too long. I watched them do this big, long, elongated version of what I felt I was at the beginning of the road of with my partner, where eventually my parents were in separate rooms. They worked in different cities. They had secret new partners, and as that went on over the years, they lived in this. They didn't like each other. It was a horrible, kind of bundle of lies. And actually, I genuinely look back. God, it's hard not to get emotional. I look back at that childhood and think it was the lies and the dislike of each other. It was living in that space with two people who didn't like each other, who weren't there together, who had no physical proximity with each other. I remember seeing them hug once in my life, my parents, and it was a Christmas day, drunk, and I remember as a child getting in on the hug and then feeling guilty for decades that I'd wrecked the one hug I'd seen them have, and I didn't want my son growing up with that. And I thought, actually, that was another thing where I thought, I don't want my son to grow up with two people who don't behave like they like each other. I would rather he grew up with two separated parents who were happy.
That's just the message. That's just the message we try and help people with, because so many people have that sort of misguided idea that you have to stay together for the kids and it'll be a disaster for the kids if you split up. But you you were just saying all the right things in terms of that's not how life pans out. What kids want are two happy parents, and kids can and will understand and can thrive if they've got two happy separated parents. What they can't deal with is, what you've sadly had to go through in your childhood. It's much harder to cope with that as a kid.
And I feel like I do need to add, though, I'm only speaking to my experience. My son's dad, I think, still right until the end, he said, I think we can fix it. And I knew I couldn't from my end.
But again, that's interesting, because you're describing this, you're telling the story of the person who left. Your partner, is on the other end of it, which is the partner who was left, because you ultimately made the decision. And I always think that's super interesting in, when we deal with couples in the work that we do. So we've usually, not always, because sometimes there's a mutual decision, but usually we've got someone who's the leaver and someone who's the left, and they're in very different emotional spaces. And the timescales for those emotional spaces is really interesting. You were just describing them, which I thought was fascinating, that it took you a long time to action that decision. So if you think about that, you've had many months, it sounds like even maybe years, of coming to that decision, and then all of a sudden the person on the other end of that hears it in an instant, and they have to deal with all of that in the instant. So it's going to take those people a lot longer to emotionally catch up to where you are in that whole sort of change process, I guess.
Absolutely, and I think, there had been conversations, and I think I'd even had a conversation where I'd said, I think I might be irretrievably unhappy in this relationship, and he had said, no, I'm really confident we can fix this, and I've gone, okay, let's try. And it hadn't worked, and actually having what had felt like something utterly impossible to leave the relationship, and I think apparently this is quite normal as well, like we signed a contract on a new house, and that in that moment, signing a 2-year contract was the avalanche of emotion that was, oh no, I've got to go. I can't. It's not that I can't. It's that I must. I must. I'm breaking under the weight of this. And I think, as you were saying there, with like two people having two different truths, he will have a completely different take on this. And he is, if I ever talk about this, like on this podcast, I try really hard to express that this is only my side of this. And also I think, sorry, I've got a noisy cat meowing. I did. But yeah, he has been the most classy ex I could ever hoped for, and that is above and beyond the number one reason that's made this, from my point of view, a successful separation. And there are lots of things to take into account in terms of the actual physical leaving, and I think one of the main ones is, if you are the person who's doing the leaving and the person who's left doesn't want to be left, I think it's really, really important to take responsibility and ownership for the hurt you are causing that person. And not to brush over it, not to expect them to be fine, even years on. And not,
you're right.
Not to live with shame and guilt. It's not about... it's not about, if you need to be in unbearable pain all the time to do that. That's not what I mean. But you can acknowledge it and feel it. I still feel it. If I talk about it, I still feel emotional about the sadness I've caused him and the changes in his life that I've inflicted on him that he wouldn't want. And I, with that in mind, try to compensate for that in how we live our lives now. And make his life as close to one that he wants as possible. And that will morph and change gradually over the years as our lives go in different ways. But whilst we are connected by parenting a still young son, he's only 7, I think that's really important to do, and to just like soak the situation in empathy and lack of ego. And I don't mean lack of self-respect and boundaries and those things. They're always going to come into it. They're always in play. But I look at so many friends of friends breakups, especially when there are kids involved, and think, I think it's such a cliche to say, well, put the kid first and it'll all work out all right. But actually, it's really hard to do that, and it does involve
really
leaving
hard.
your ego and your emotions at the door. And he has had to do so much work on that front, as has my fiance, my partner, because that's three people with completely different emotional takes on this situation, all acting all the time in a 7-year-old's best interests, and not their own. And that's a big ask from me as well to those people.
It's huge, because you are not in control of it. You are reliant on the other people as much as you are reliant on yourself. So where, lots of people can get to a place of personal harmony or personal acceptance, it all starts to come a little bit unstuck if they don't meet the desired response from the other people who are in the game. And you've not now just got your ex-partner, you've got a new partner in the game as well. So suddenly the dynamics are multiplied, aren't they? Because you've got your relationship with your current partner, your relationship with your ex-partner, and their relationship together. They have a relationship between them as well. And so all of a sudden, you've got so many more relationships to be thinking about, trying to manage, all in the best interests of this 7-year-old child, as you say. So it becomes incredibly complex. Just talk a little bit about, so we've got to the point where the relationship came to an end. How did you move from, there is an element of being self-obsessed or involved at the point of a breakup. Of course there is, for all of us. How do you move from that state where you're grieving, and for the person who's left in particular, they are extremely raw? How do you move from that to a more co-parenting agenda? What do you remember about that time and that shift? Was it a shift, or?
Yeah, it was. It's really complicated, and logistically. My life is, anyway, because of the nature of my work, no 2 days look the same for me. So we were already used to a situation where our schedule revolved around my commitments, whereas his work life is a lot more reliable and his whole life is a lot more predictable. So I got brilliant advice from a friend, a recently divorced friend, to have an online spreadsheet, like a colour-coded childcare, but also kind of online calendar, everything in this spreadsheet, and that we still use now and rely on very heavily. And we've learned a system of how, if we're going to update that, to give a text as well if anything within the next fortnight has changed in there, and just to communicate loads. I think because we already had that system in place, it didn't feel as brutal as it might otherwise to put a system like that in place, because we pretty much had to live like that even when we were still together. We stayed living in the same house until he had somewhere else sorted. Initially he lived on the same road, and that changed a few years later, post-pandemic. But during the pandemic, I have to say that was incredible from my point of view, to be able to walk. We obviously were allowed a bubble with a co-parent, and to be able to walk up and down that road with a then 3-year-old, 3-4-year-old. I'd say emotionally, it was a roller coaster. I can't speak to his side of that. For me, I remember being surprised how quickly I was interested in dating, but for fun and for fun only. And I think I have to say there was part of that was that, and it wasn't anything to do with why I ended the relationship, but in the years preceding that, I'd felt the burgeoning bisexuality, which I'd discussed with him, and we'd had really open, totally lovely conversations about that. But once I was single, and I did wait until I was single, I did think, well, I don't want to not explore that. That's a new and overwhelming feeling. like, so I quite quickly was up for dating, but for fun, and then I was really knocked for six by how quickly I was having emotions in those new situations. I was like, I thought there would be a longer
fun period.
I really did. I had no idea my heart was on my sleeve already. I know it's a very sciencey way of putting it. Yeah. But there it was, I was like, I can notice, I'm old enough now to clock when that's happening. Yeah. It feels a bit cyclical, but there are times where it feels like, and sometimes you fall in love with the person you're already with all over again. Yeah. But it's chemical. I'm a horrible grotty realist. Mm-hmm. There were massive waves of oxytocin, etc. Like, I was like, I'm vulnerable to falling in love here, and I am going to have to see how cautious. I need to, gosh. So that was a thing. I think in terms of the emotions of the early days, I don't think there was any way to be prepared. There would be times where I felt fine. There'd be times where I'd on a long drive and I'd just cry for 4 hours about how much change was happening in my life. But it wasn't all, sad crying. It wasn't like a heartbreak. It was, I think my mum uses a very romantic term for it, like a watershed. It felt like that. It felt like there was a lot of...
just the enormity of the moment. So isn't it? It's kind of the acknowledgement that you are leaving some hopes and dreams and expectations of where you thought you were going. Yeah. And if you're the person deciding, you can see that as an optimistic point, like you were just describing your chance to experiment with your sexuality. And so that feels very opportunistic all of a sudden, doesn't it?
Yeah,
but
it does. And then
that doesn't mean to say, that you're still not going to feel some of those other emotions, which is, I've left what I thought I wanted. I'm now looking at something quite different. Like you say, I feel guilt about that. And it's just trying to process all of those emotions, which seem to almost randomly hit you on a daily basis or an hourly basis, don't they? There doesn't seem to be, there is a pattern, a broad pattern, but the point about the pattern is that you're going through a grief cycle and that it's not a linear process. There are things coming at you all of the different time, and it takes a while to sort of get into a bit more of a steady state, I guess.
It took ages, and there were lots of things that I just... I didn't know to prepare for. There were things I cocked up. Go
on, give us an example. Let's hear a big cock up.
When we were moving into that house, my son loved sharing a bed with me. Still does, and he's 7. Any opportunity, if you're staying at a house that there aren't enough beds, he'd be like, "We can go. You can go together. You can cuddle me all night." And I remember thinking, "Oh well, it's fine that I haven't built his bed, because he can sleep in with me for a couple of nights." And I remember that. His behaviour taking an incredible turn, and me being like, oh, and then thinking, oh God, of course he hasn't got a room. He hasn't got a room. Everything's changing in his life, and he hasn't got a flipping bed. And thinking, oh God, and dropping everything and building the bed, and it all was fine. But that felt like an enormous what were you thinking? I don't know, the cock-ups like that. I also remember the first time I ever, and I was looking forward to it. I had work to do that I was looking forward to doing. I can't remember what else, but I remember the first time I ever dropped him to his dad's in his dad's flat, and having basically a really fun day ahead of me, and never been one of those people who was like, I was emotional when I took him on his first day at school, but I love all of my life, including being a parent, and I'm not someone who was sad about using childcare, and not taking him to his dad's is using childcare, but equally I'm not someone who's emotional every time I say goodbye to my son. I like getting on with my life as well. The first time I dropped him at his dad's flat, that door closing and being like, oh, what have I done? Really, really. And that was the next 2 hours was a write-off, just sobbing. Big waves I wasn't ready for, and I don't think there's any way to be ready for. And there's also no point particularly overanalyzing it in advance and trying to... I know if maybe different people, different ways, but for me...
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm a planner, so I like to go through the emotions in my head first. But I get what you mean. It seems a little bit self-defeating a lot of the time, I'll be honest. Yeah. But you're right, we don't talk about it. There aren't very many books about it. We don't acknowledge there's a transition and a difference from being a parent to a co-parent. It's a really kind of developed area of kind of discourse in society, and I think those things therefore do catch you out a lot of the time. It is hard the first time you do the handover. It's tough, and just getting used to living in a different way. There's a big difference between being happy not to see your kid because you're working and doing stuff versus that you can't because you've agreed with the other parent that this is their time.
Yeah.
It's the enforced nature of it that sometimes catches you out. This isn't just I'm going off to work, or I'm going to spend time with my friends, and I've agreed that someone else is looking after my child. This isn't your timetable, it's somebody else's timetable, and I think that's challenging.
Yeah. There was lots of that. I think having been used to him and I knowing everything about where the other one was and what the other one was up to, I think, again, a few missteps from me, but, you know, times where we were co-parenting, for example, when I was at a festival for work, and I remember being like, well, what sort of time are you going to be back? And then be like, oh, and him having to say, you don't tell me anything about your life now, so it's also not okay to ask me that anymore. I was like, oh, yeah sorry, see when I see you. Like, I get it. Like, okay, yeah, God, I do. And actually, I've got, you know, we've both, I think, got much better at that over time.
I think they're interesting things, aren't they? That level of control you have. And sometimes people use the co-parenting as a way to stay involved in the other parent's life. And I think that can be really dangerous and quite tough, because it starts to feel quite uncomfortable, usually for one or other of the parents. But it is important, like you say, to actually separate. And what I love about the story, and I guess where you've done so well in creating an atmosphere where you can make mistakes and it not be right, this is serious, we have to go to the court to get this sorted out, or we need to get somebody else involved to sort this out. So what you're showing us is that the way that you've gone about the breakup has given you some capital. It's given you a license, both of you, to make mistakes and it not be the end of the world, but to accept the mistakes you make and to expect this is not a perfect world. There is no perfect right way of co-parenting post-separation. You have to find your way, but you're able to find your way in an environment of tolerance, and that speaks volumes. I'm in such admiration.
Oh, thanks.
I think genuinely, I didn't create that.
You know, he's been incredibly classy through, I think, much more painful emotional struggle with it than me, and he's just stayed classy is the only word I can think of for it, really. And there've been moments where it's not been ideal. You know, there've been moments we have fallen out since in the years. You know, over bits where we parent differently. We've got different takes on education, you know, we've got those things I've learned on the hoof. We've had a fallout during a parents' evening that afterwards I've gone, right, we need to do a pre-brief and a debrief before parents' evenings if you're going to go. I had no idea he was going to bring up the things that, you know, and then similarly, but then it was like, well, it's on me. I've been too busy to even think to have a conversation before we're in a room together, actually having a really important thing. Then all his takes are valid, as are mine. We need to meet before, lesson learned, meet beforehand, and present a united front in the room, or at least say in the room in a calm way. Don't sit there being surprised and crying in front of a primary school teacher, for Christ's sake, Jess. You know, like, there have been loads of mistakes. I also don't want to present it as having been entirely idyllic. I think we're also, and I think compared to other separated co-parents I know, a unique situation in the sense that there's never been a fight over who gets our son. No one would have even dared. Neither of us would have dared say, well, I'll bring our son up. Good luck trying to see him. Never any of that. And if anything, you know, I think my ex panicked when we broke up, because up until that point, he'd done a lot of parenting, while my work was really made me quite absent at times for various patches of time. And actually, one of his practical panics about me leaving was that he was going to end up, you know, living in a small, you know, and having to do all the parenting. And I was like, right, well, let's address that straight off the bat. And I can promise you, he likes clear, set, predictable, you know, rules and patterns.
I like the sound of him.
And I remember being like, well, I promise, and I made a pact in my mind that he will never ever do more than 50% of the childcare in any given month. And actually, with the pandemic changing my work patterns and my priorities changing, and being in a privileged position in terms of where my career's gone to be fussier, I've made that's been all right. That's been pretty easy to do. And if an exceptional thing came up that meant I go away for a month now, there would be a really serious conversation about maybe I'll take him with me. Like, I've never let my ex do more than half, and I probably do 2/3, occasionally teetering on 3/4 of the parenting, and he's very happy with that. And I think, and actually, as time's gone on, he's got more confident going, can I have this, like, this night and this night? Definitely not with our son, because I want to do, he doesn't even have to tell me what he wants to do, but, you know, all sorts of, you know, but you learn, and there'll be times where you'll be like, oh, I wish you could just get a sitter and arrange that yourself on your clock, you know. And I think, in that way, I have lots of takes on it. I think generally in heterosexual relationships, there's still a lot of evidence. I'm working on something that's based on a white paper at the moment that the woman in those relationships, the mum, has the massive amount of the mental load. And I've still got that in our setup. I've got, you know, and it is exhausting. And I would say, but it requires, successful separation for us has required an extraordinary level of organisation and flexibility. It's just about being so much planning, so much organising. Yeah.
And so what about a new relationship? Just talk to us a little bit about how that changed the dynamic then, because like you say, you kind of learn by trial and error. There's two of you in it. As you said as well, it's a heterosexual relationship, so there's some kind of norms and expectations that are going along with that. So then you drop in a new relationship, and a relationship that's bringing another woman into the scene. So what was that like? Talk us through that.
Fascinating, and not how I'd have expected it. Again, sort of surprised me. I had no idea I'd fall in love so quickly, or let alone with someone who was so, like, up for getting into a relationship with someone who had a kid, you know.
Getting to that always surprises me.
But I thought you've got no idea what you've just signed up for, and people can't. I think if they haven't parented, they don't. But anyway, this worked out all right. There's been ups and downs. There was a slightly rocky start, and there had to be conversations about how it's also part of doing the best thing for our son to be friendly and civil and a cheerful front presented on that front. And actually, obviously, it will have been the hardest at the beginning, I think. And but then it got to the point where, because of that, for example, the Christmas that was cancelled very last minute because of COVID, we ended up having Christmas, the three of us adults and my son, and because we were all
that's kind of like a baptism of fire, isn't it?
Yeah. Because we were all so ready for how hard
that's got a sitcom written all over it.
But it went great. Everyone was ready for it, and it went great. And actually, because I think one of the most emotionally tangy parts of the separation was the fact that we would, both of us, have to spend every other Christmas day not with our son.
Yeah.
And that was like and then actually, because that has worked out so well, we can now have a situation, and this is like hats off to her and to him, where we only have to go every third Christmas without spending Christmas Day with our son, because we're going to do every third one, just us. It's kind of brilliant. That's kind of brilliant. But again, I think that's on them. That's on them for having been such big people to be able to do that.
Well, it's on all of you, isn't it? Because it's about the relationships you're prepared to create, and about being able to tolerate relationships, the nature of relationships changing, and letting go. You know, you've had to let go.
Yeah, and I think there is an element of going, do you know what, it's a couple of hours on a day.
Yeah.
If you think of it as, lots of people have to spend Christmas Day with people they wouldn't choose to spend time with. You know, everyone's got family members who aren't their favourite. And I think it's an element of that again. It's actually a couple of hours. It's actually one day.
Yeah.
There's going to be
and it doesn't have to be the 25th of December, does
no.
it? You can change it up, so you can have two Christmases on different days. It's about being creative with it, isn't it? And not slipping into the sort of predefined cultural norms. I think if you can rise above that.
Version of things. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Well, look, I'm just conscious of time. It's just been amazing to talk to you. If you
Thanks for
had to
having
say,
me.
kind of sum up the biggest lesson or the biggest tip, so someone's listening to this, they're at the point of deciding, whether or not they're going to leave or not. What would you say to them? What would you want them to hear, having listened to us chat?
I think if you're irretrievably unhappy, I think if you've got kids, I think that was the biggest thing, was me having the experience of my parents and living for years with two parents in a horrible situation where even if just one of them, in my parents' situation, I think it was both, were irretrievably unhappy, and letting that fester and grow and toxify a home, it is better to get out. But you can, there's not a pain-free way of separating, but there are kind ways of doing it, and it's about responsibility, ownership, honesty, clarity, being definitive in your decision.
And it sounds like doing it together. It sounds like what you've managed to do is say, okay, our romantic relationship is over. We now have a different relationship, and we don't know what that's going to look like or where it's going to lead us, but we're going to do all of this together. Yeah.
And I think just other stuff, it's just practical. I feel it's very hard to give a succinct answer on this. I think if one of you earns a lot more than the other one, can you offset that pain for them then? Can you offset that in different... It does not gendered. Nothing has to be put through lawyers. Just be practical and be kind. Make it fair. Are you going to make them in a situation where they've suddenly got masses less income because they have to, and you can afford to help them? Do it. It's not about ego. It's not about gender. Make it as simple as it needs to be for everybody to move through that grief, that emotion and that change, and take ego out of it. Not emotion, because they need to be felt, but I think it's I think that's a brilliant summary. I think if people just listen to that last little snippet, that's all that this is about for us, and this is what we do. We try and help people come to those arrangements and work in the way that you've just been describing. So thank you, Jess. My pleasure.
Been absolutely fascinating. Now just tell us, where can people find out and see you at the moment? What are you doing? All sorts, actually. I'm working up a new show. It doesn't even have a title yet, but I will be touring that from early 2024. I have a series on BBC Sounds called Sturdy Girl Club, an audio series. I have a short coming out on Sky very soon called Real Friends, about an adult who's still got her imaginary friend. Play a big imaginary ice cream in that, called Mr. Whippy. Nice. What else? I have a podcast called Hoovering that's all about eating and people's relationships with eating. Nice. Okay, check that out, everybody. That sounds great. Thank you, Jess. It's been absolutely wonderful talking to you today. And of course, you can find out more about me on Twitter. I'm at Kate_Daly. You can also hear on Twitter new podcast episodes by subscribing for updates by visiting thedivorcepodcast.com on your favourite listening platforms. Thanks, Jess. Fabulous to talk to you, and thank you, everybody, for listening.